You would think that defining eras such as modern, vintage, in anything would be simple, pretty clear cut, even in sports cards, but it's actually pretty debatable and it's not clear at all. I never really thought about it until I thought about it, but I don't really know how to clearly define vintage versus modern. I was watching a video by Bonkers Cards, drop him a follow if you don't, he does pretty much all vintage. And one of the comments on it said, how do you define vintage? What years are vintage? And I thought about that and I said, that's a fantastic question. I don't know. Now, I've seen random places on the internet, sports card shops, etc., that have defined years, but vintage changes with time, right? There's modern and there's ultra modern. Is there vintage and ultra vintage? Does vintage not change with time? I suppose it does. And I don't know what defines vintage anymore. For me, I think of like anything 89 or newer is definitely not being vintage. Comfortable with all those cards. I think of vintage as being more something starting with a 7. 1970 something is where vintage starts in my mind. But do I think that way because stuff in the 80s just can't be vintage yet? It just can't be that old? Or do I think that way because things I'm comfortable with must be modern items that I'm comfortable with, and vintage is just something before me and that I'm not comfortable with it? Or somewhere in the hobby, should there be a defining number of years? I don't think that there's one answer. I think that vintage is different for different people. I don't think that there's one, these years are vintage and these years are modern. I don't think it matters that much. I think what matters is each person's own personal definition of vintage, which makes it that much more complicated. Now, could we somewhere establish an acceptable range of vintage years? Probably. That would be fine. That gives you a ballpark area, and I think the 80s kind of blurs that area. But for how many people would an early 2000s card seem vintage to right now? How many young collectors, hobbyists, entrepreneurs are running around card shows and they think that a early 2000s Tom Brady game use patch card is definitely vintage? At what point does the hobby shift as a whole, and do we start referring to early 2000 cards as vintage? I don't know, but I wanted to ask, what years do you think of when you think of vintage cards?